Actually, the leap of faith, to give it the memorable name that Soren Kierkegaard bestowed upon it, is an imposture. As he himself pointed out, it is not a leap that can be made once and for all. It is a leap that has to go on and on being performed in spite of mounting evidence to the contrary. This effort is actually too much for the human mind and leads to delusions and manias. Religion understands perfectly well that the leap is subject to sharply diminishing returns, which is why it often doesn't in fact rely on faith at all, but instead corrupts faith and insults reason.
You are listening to A Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates science, secular humanism, and the courage it takes to embrace an evidence-based life of doubt and questioning. Hello listeners, Nathan Dickey here. I have what I think is a really great interview for you this week with Chris Shelton, the ex-Scientologist who managed to leave the cult of Scientology after having spent over 25 years as an adherent, and now spends his days exposing the dangers of Scientology and other cults. We ended up covering a lot of ground and talked for over 2 hours. And so for listening convenience, I have divided up our interview into 2 parts. Patrons of my show will have access to parts 1 and 2 together at the same time. The second half of our interview will be available to everyone else a week from now. Thank you, Jeff, Jeannie, Torsten, and Chris for being my patrons. Your support and friendship mean a great deal to me and is very much appreciated. I also want to take this moment to again thank my friend Hertzie, this time for having me as a guest on her YouTube show, Hertzie Talks. Before that, I was on the Minnesota Atheist talk radio show, which she also hosts. Both Hertzie and I have a deep interest and fascination in the infamous satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s. On the episode of Hertzie Talks that I participated in, she and I spent 3 hours doing a point-by-point deconstruction, somewhat in the style of god-awful movies, of a fundamentalist television program made in 1984 called Deception of a Generation. This is a program in which 2 grown men talk for an hour and a half about why they actually believed children's toys and cartoons of the day were inspired by the occult and Satanism, and how Antichrist was using these toys and cartoons to take control of children's minds. We covered a lot of ground and managed to find time for some important social commentary and psychological issues relating to fundamentalist moral panics, while talking at length about He-Man, She-Ra, Thundercats, Dungeons and Dragons, Smurfs, Care Bears. Yes, fucking Care Bears was believed to be a part of an evil satanic plot to lead children to hell. And a load of other cartoons and comic books. We both had a great time diving into all this craziness, and if you're interested, I will have a link to that episode in the show notes. And now, without further ado, the Chris Shelton interview. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Welcome, listeners, to Leap of Doubt, the podcast that celebrates questioning, curiosity, and free inquiry, because the only thing anyone should not doubt is one's own capacity and ability to doubt, to change one's mind in light of new evidence or knowledge newly learned. My guest for this episode has taken this to heart. For 27 years, Chris Shelton was a devout believer in and a staff member of the Church of Scientology, the enigmatic and powerful cult belief system founded by science fiction pulp writer L. Ron Hubbard in the mid-20th century. Chris left Scientology behind him for good in 2013 and has been an outspoken critic of Scientology and an anti-cult activist ever since. Welcome, Chris Shelton. Good to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Let's start as a way of introducing the topic with a discussion of the stark contrast between what Scientology really is and what it presents itself as being to the world.
Sure. To be blunt and right to the point on that, Scientology is a money-making scam. it uses religious cloaking. It presents itself as a religious philosophy that its believers truly do believe in. I mean, don't get me wrong on that. It's not like everybody who's running around in Scientology are a bunch of frauds. It's that they are being conned.
Mm-hmm.
Scientology was an outgrowth of Dianetics, something L. Ron Hubbard wrote in 1950. So by 1953, he had tanked Dianetics twice, and out of the ashes of that came the Church of Scientology, and it was an effort to explain, life and past lives, and offer an explanation of a spiritual existence, and the idea that you could free yourself from the endless cycle of life and death, and life after death, and life after death, and sort of a Western idea of what Buddhism is all about. That's
Mm-hmm.
not what Buddhism is all about, but that's kind of what Westerners think Buddhism is all about. And so I always have to put that caveat on there. Otherwise, the actual Buddhists come after me, right? Because they go, no, that's not what we're doing.
It's the popular culture conception in the West of Buddhism.
Exactly. So Buddhism is a much deeper philosophy than Scientology could ever dream of being.
Mm-hmm.
And so he develops this thing called Scientology. Hubbard does, and it starts very small. It was really just he really had tanked Dianetics quite hard, and so he really had a small group of people, and he went out to Phoenix and started this organization and grew it over through the 1950s into a international organization of people who thought that by using Hubbard's techniques and methods, they could advance themselves spiritually up various levels that Hubbard developed, where each level represented an increase in spiritual ability and awareness. And by the end of, at the top of all of these levels, crossing over what Hubbard called the bridge to total freedom was the analogy that he used.
Mm-hmm.
You would have achieved personal spiritual immortality and the ability to be in the driver's seat, in a position of what they call cause over life, is the idea of Scientology. And it's a pretty powerful carrot. A lot of people really pursue that and put a lot of money and a lot of time into trying to achieve that. Unfortunately, what you find at the end of the rainbow is, not so much advancement, not so much, your life is really no different. You're still faced with the same problems of the tax man and the crying kids and the job problems and the financial issues, all of those things that make up the problems of our life. For upper level Scientologists, they have the same problems, if not worse, because they've now handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, to Scientology. They're that much poorer for the experience, and that's what Scientology does.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like any belief system that promises certainty is bound to fail.
Well, kind of, because uncertainty is sort of the one certainty of life. And so, here Scientology presents itself. In fact, one of its earliest descriptions was that it was the science of certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And that it had all the answers. Later on, Hubbard claimed that Scientology was the one thing that was senior to life because it explains all of life. Well, that's a nice sales pitch, but it doesn't explain all of life. There are many, many things that go on in our day-to-day lives that are elements of life that are not explained by Scientology, that L. Ron Hubbard never offered any solutions or answers for. And one of my biggest, I guess I'll use the word disappointment, although it really doesn't even begin to describe the depth of this feeling. But one of my biggest disappointments in coming, near the end of my Scientology experience, and in fact, one of the final nails in the coffin, so to speak, was when I found out what the contents of those upper levels of Scientology are, and how illogical they are, and how they do not answer any of the questions Hubbard promised I would be getting answers to. And when I learned that, I really was done with Scientology forever.
And that's not the experience of a lot of people who reached the upper tiers. I've read that by the time they get to those upper levels, even OT3, the operating Thetan level 3, where they learn about Xenu and beyond, they've already invested so much of their time and money and energy that they're almost invested to the point where they're reluctant to question it. It's like I think of the analogy, even though this is not scientifically accurate, but it's a nice analogy anyway, of the frog in water that's incrementally heated up to the point of boiling, and the frog, according to this analogy, remains in the boiling water and dies as a result because the increase is so incremental. Would you say there's a similar process going on with the different levels?
Oh, absolutely. We've used that analogy many times, in fact. That is, there are words for this in sociology and psychology, but really it's just a matter of investment. You've invested so much of your life into a belief system. And this is true beyond Scientology. This applies universally to almost anything. And when you find that you've come to a place where you have wasted your time, it's very, very, very hard for most people to accept that and be able to just move on. Most people feel that, no, I've put this much into it. I need to give it another chance. I need to give this a fair shake. I haven't, as much as I've given, I haven't given enough. They'll come up with the cognitive dissonance of their investment versus the failure of any return on that investment, or a very, very minimal return compared to the volume of their investment. They just find this unacceptable, but they can't deal with the reality of that, because it's a harsh reality, to realize that you have been taken advantage of, that you have been fooled, that you were susceptible to being fooled. Nobody likes to think of themselves as being susceptible to that. Most people have very high opinions of themselves. And it's not that they shouldn't. It's just that sometimes those opinions are unwarranted, because we do silly things. And when we do silly things, if we can't acknowledge that we've done that and learn from the experience, well, that's not very good. That's not very good critical thinking, but that's kind of a psychological factor that people have to learn to deal with.
Well, we've thrown in a lot of terms and ideas that we'll probably explore later on in this episode, like operating Thetan and Dianetics and all of that. But to backtrack and start on more of an intro level, I broadly established why you are, in fact, an expert on Scientology, but let's flesh out your street cred, as it were, as someone with first-hand insider knowledge further, and start with your personal story of how you got involved, your life inside, and the process of how you escaped.
Sure. It's a bit of a story, but I'll be quick with this. I was actually raised with Scientology. I'm a second gen, what we call second generation, right? Somebody who's raised in it. And my parents got involved with Scientology when I was about 4 years old, and they had been divorced. My dad got involved, and then he, even though they were divorced, he got my mother involved. They ended up getting back together, getting remarried. And so most of my childhood experience was, in regards to Scientology, was sort of the idea that it had successfully, reunited my parents, and therefore it was a good thing. And my parents worked for the organization. I was, of course, growing up and going to school. And it wasn't until I was about 15 years old that, while I had learned a lot of the lingo and a lot of the concepts of Scientology as a child, I had that level of understanding of it. I didn't really participate. And when I was 15, I signed up for my first classes, and I was sold. I got totally hooked on it, and the promises of it. The initial sales pitch was for a communications class, because as a 15-year-old nerdy, geeky kid in school, I couldn't get dates. And so therefore, this communications course was going to teach me how to talk to girls, which I think any 15-year-old boy, especially the geeky, nerdy ones, would jump at the chance to, improve their chances with girls. So that was the initial effort. It had nothing to do with spiritual advancement or improvement of any kind. And a second class that I took, in fact, was a study class. Hubbard has a whole methodology of how to study material and learn better. And of course, I thought that was something I could use as well. And I sold myself on the idea that I was a better communicator and that I was a better studier or student as a result of these, even though the results in the real world didn't really pan out. I didn't get any more dates. I wasn't any more popular in school, really. And I didn't fail school by any means. I was not a bad, unintelligent student already, but it's not like I came out with a 4.0 as a result of doing this study class. Not far from it. So, so they promise the sun, moon, and stars, but you're really not delivering on those promises. But you can convince yourself that you're a better person pretty much through almost any process. And that was what I did. And I was rather naive. I did not have much real world experience at 15 years old or after I had graduated high school and I was 17. And that was when they went in pretty hard on me to start working for the church. And this was in Santa Barbara, California. So I signed up. They love bombed me, which means they gratuitously compliment you and tell you how wonderful you are and really pump up the ego and push those buttons of self-importance. And so I thought I was the cat's meow, the bee's knees, and that I was going to literally save the world. I was going to contribute to saving the world. That's what this whole thing was all about. So again, not a lot in terms of joining the cause for spiritual advancement or improvement. That wasn't really the prize that my eye was on. It was more about, feeling good about myself because I was a very insecure 17-year-old. And this subject and these people really seemed to dig me. They thought I was really a good guy. And so I could help out and be part of this movement. And I wanted to be part of something important. I was 17 years old, so I signed up, and for the next 8 years, I worked for the Church of Scientology in Santa Barbara. When I was 25 years old, I had hardly 2 cents to rub together. I'd been working for this organization on an almost volunteer basis for 8 years, and the idea was that it had not grown or expanded or gotten better because we had not been following L. Ron Hubbard's directions closely enough. And it was basically on us that we weren't doing well. It had nothing to do with, whether Scientology worked or not. Because that's one thing you learn early on in Scientology is it's never Scientology's fault for something that's going wrong, right? It's always on you. So I doubled down and I joined the Sea organization. The SEA organization, as in the ocean. It's a paramilitary group within the world of Scientology that is sort of the core followers of Scientology and the ones who really keep it going. There's maybe 4,000 or 5,000 Sea Org members all over the world. And I became one. And I moved down to Los Angeles. And for the next 17 years, I worked my ass off for the Sea Org and got really nothing for it. I didn't make one level of advancement on the spiritual side of Scientology. I had made advancement as a staff member in Santa Barbara. I had gotten up to the level that they call clear, which is a state where you're supposedly no longer are suffering from the stresses and traumas of your past. And so I'd gotten to that level. And then when I joined the Sea Org, I proceeded to make no advancement of any kind. But I certainly worked hard. And being the slow learner that I am, after 17 years, I finally twigged on the fact that maybe my life wasn't really what I wanted it to be. And I wasn't saving the world. We weren't doing anything of any real importance. And I realized that this was kind of not something I wanted to be doing anymore. So I left the Sea organization. I still wanted to practice Scientology. I just didn't want to work for the group anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I was somewhat ostracized for this. They let me go, but they treated me pretty badly and thought that I should make amends for having left. And after dedicating 25 years of my life to the group, I didn't particularly feel like I owed them a whole lot of amends. But that was, that's the mindset in Scientology. So I attempted to do some work on that, but they weren't really having much of it. And I ended up getting on the internet and learning all about L. Ron Hubbard and Dianetics and Scientology's real history, which is completely obscured when you're in the church. They have a whole different idea of who L. Ron Hubbard was, what his past was, what his war record was, his schooling. I mean, he flunked out of college, but according to Scientology, they say he took, he was a successful graduate of the very first course in atomic physics and in atomic and molecular phenomena. And he himself claimed to be an atomic physicist in the 1950s. I mean, this guy had no shame whatsoever about lying, just blatantly, grossly lying about his own past. So we had a very different idea of who he was, how Scientology had come about. That there was nothing in Dianetics and Scientology. When you're part of the group, you have no idea that Hubbard bankrupted Dianetics twice in 1950 and 51. That information is just not there. So I learned things I had no idea about, coming out. And that, sort of facilitated my complete exit from the entire subject. But along the way, Scientology decided that, that their parting shot to me would be that they would label me a suppressive person, because learning all of this new information about Scientology, I decided that I should say something about this in a public forum. I was very, very upset about having learned that I'd been lied to all those years. Mm-hmm. And in speaking out against it, well, that's one of the biggest crimes you can commit as a Scientologist, is to be critical of the church itself. And so I was labeled a suppressive person, and I was forcefully disconnected from all of my friends and anybody who I was close to, including at the time a fiance that I had who was a Scientologist, her whole family, all of them. Overnight, I was persona non grata, and I lost those relationships. I'd lost friendships that I'd had for over 20 years. And I can no longer, talk to those people. They won't talk to me. They won't communicate with me in any way. I can try to communicate to them, but they won't answer. And so I now have this label of suppressive person because I, speak critically about the church. And that has been, that was another big problem the church presented me. So I've continued to advocate against it, to advocate for critical thinking and for sense and reason, because that's sort of the opposite of how Scientologists think. And I've recovered from I've been recovering from the experience. It is, when you're part of a group that has such high control methods as Scientology, there's a recovery process. It's not just something you walk away from and go, oh yeah, no big deal. Right. 27 years was a majority of my life. I left when I was 43, and I, had very deep beliefs in Hubbard's system, and so having to relearn the truth and then shed all those lies, that's a slow process, and it's something I've been working on and trying to help other people with.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really great summary of your story.
Yeah.
Do you think there was, have you always been, was there something under the surface that made you receptive to new information, or was it kind of just a new revelation that you were capable of looking at this critically and changing your beliefs in light of it? I know a lot of people who come out of various belief systems, there was always something under the surface, a certain tendency to think critically, but they suppressed it their whole life until they came out. Was there anything like that tendency in you, or was it kind of just an all of a sudden epiphany that I need to change this belief system of mine?
It was a gradual process. I always had and this was something I didn't really think about or consciously, put on the front burner. I was so dedicated to Scientology that I didn't really think about logic or reason or critical thinking. In fact, the word critical in Scientology is a bad word. So you don't want to be a critical thinker as a Scientologist. You want to think of yourself that way. And so I didn't really think about that. But the thing about being in a destructive cult group, no matter what the group is, whether it's a religious group, political group, even a sports group or a sports club or something. I mean, destructive cults come in all shapes and sizes. The one thing you can't apply critical thinking to is the group that you're part of, the destructive cult. That's the one thing that cannot be questioned. That authority is absolute. And so I never tried to apply critical thinking to Scientology. I was in a frame of mind of acceptance and belief. And anything L. Ron Hubbard had to say simply had to be the unvarnished truth. That was simply the way it was. And so I aligned all of my thinking around that. And when you do something like that, you lose critical thinking skills because anything should be up for debate and question and remark. And I, could not do that with Scientology itself. So once the process of questioning this group was a slow process. I mean, at first it was little things, and then suddenly around 2002, something fairly large happened. In 2003, I think it was, and that kind of was very eye-opening for me. Working for the Sea Organization, something happened that made me really question the validity of what was going on, and I really threw me for a spin. I did not. It was a very bad time for me, and I was trying to reconcile that, with the belief system that I'd been literally raised with.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a struggle, but once the questions start appearing, if you don't get satisfactory answers, the questions, they stay in your head. They just kind of bounce around. And that was what happened with me as I was struggling to resolve these things. These questions I had, the problems I was having, the situations I was having were not resolving easily. The questions were not being answered well. And so I continued to struggle for years trying to resolve this until finally, about 9 years later, like I said, I'm a bit of a slow learner, but it took me about 9 years to finally twig on, oh, wait a minute, this is really not what it presents itself as being. And I really need to stop working for this group because this is not giving me anything back. And I'm really not helping people to the degree that I want to be. So it became so obvious to me that it was all about money. There was always this thread of money in the background, but over the years that I was involved, it actually did get worse. It was always, a money-making scam. But when I got involved in the 80s and the 90s, I was able to overcome the money part because there was all this other stuff I thought we were doing, or the emphasis was on other things. But the longer I was in, and the longer it went on, the more money motivated it became, and there was an extreme amount of pressure to make money, to hit quotas. We were given numerical quotas of how much money needed to be made on a weekly basis, and all of us were supposed to be working on that activity more so than sitting down one-on-one and helping people. And that was not what I joined for. I didn't join up to be a salesman. So it became easier and easier to move away from the organization because the organization itself was changing and becoming worse and worse and worse over the years that I was involved.
Mm-hmm. And a good example of just one of numerous examples of just how bad the church is in the context of the money-making schemes and the salesman emphasis is, was it in the 80s or early 90s when the church started setting up call centers to sell the new set of Hubbard's books and lectures for $6,500 a set? And there was immense pressure on all the call center employees, which you were fortunately able to dodge.
Yeah. Yeah, I
But
dodged that bullet, but that was only because I was actually doing something much worse. That actually happened in the 2000s.
okay.
David Miscavige took over the Church of Scientology as operations after L. Ron Hubbard died in the mid-1980s. Hubbard died in January 1986. And Miscavige has sort of ruled with an iron fist ever since. And he is a very money-motivated guy. And he is not, I don't think he's a true believer anymore. I could be wrong about that. It's completely my opinion. But he doesn't act like a Scientologist. And he doesn't treat other Scientologists like Scientologists are supposed to. And the way he runs the organization is it's all about money. It's not about delivering Scientology and the goods of it. So that's why I say those things. And he revised all of L. Ron Hubbard's basic books and released those revised editions of the books, along with a whole bunch of L. Ron Hubbard lectures that Hubbard had given in the 50s and 60s. Hubbard gave something like 3,000, 4,000 lectures. I mean, a tremendous body of work. And in terms of volume, I'm not talking about in terms of quality. And so not all of those lectures had yet been released to the public. They had initially been given to the public and recorded on reel-to-reel, cassette, magnetic tape. And there had been a recovery process and a restoration process, and so a lot of those lectures were newly released when these books were released. And this was a huge deal and rocked the Scientology world. And oh my God, this is so amazing. And isn't this incredible? And so every Scientologist was basically ordered to buy these new books and throw out their old ones and buy all these new lectures. And it cost a pretty penny. I mean, $6,500 is not nothing. And so then organizationally, all of us Sea Org members, no matter what your job was, whether you were the janitor or the chief executive of the company, or of whatever organization you were involved in, you were expected to put in 2.5 hours to 5 hours a day of intense sales through a call center that they had established. And they set these call centers up in Los Angeles and in the UK and Clearwater, Florida, and they were run in the most high-pressure, grueling way you can imagine. I mean, quotas, people standing over you, yelling at you to make those quotas. The person you're talking to on the phone can hear this happening, but they're back in the background yelling and screaming. And if you didn't, if you, for example, in the call center, you're trying to reach people on the phone. And if you can't, if nobody's picking up, you make a call, nobody picks up, you make another call, goes to voicemail, you make another call, which is pretty par for the course these days for phone calls. Not too many people just pick up. And if you didn't get somebody on the phone in 10 or 15 minutes of activity, you were made to stand up and do 25 jumping jacks or drop and give me 20, because it's somehow your fault that nobody's picking up the phone. And so you're motivated to try to, somehow spiritually connect with people and force them to pick up the phone or something. I don't know what the goal was of that. But this kind of disciplinary actions was the order of the day in these call centers. And if you didn't make, by the end of the day or the end of the night, so to speak, if you didn't make your quota, then you were sent down to the pots and pans in the galley, because the Sea Org is a full-time operation. It's 24/7. You don't go home. You go to a dorm where other Sea Org members are sleeping, right? Or if you're a married person, you guys have a room, and that's it. You're sleeping on the Sea Org base. You're eating Sea Org food. You're uniformed in Sea Org uniforms. So you're a very captive employee. You don't have somewhere else to go. So if you don't make your quotas, you get marched down to the galley and you're scrubbing pots for 3 hours before you're allowed to go to bed. And then by this point, it's literally 5 a.m. You get an hour or two of sleep, and then you get up and have to do it all over again. And this went on for a couple years. It was ridiculous. And so that was just a sampling of what life is like at the highest levels of the Church of Scientology, public Scientologists, the normal run-of-the-mill people on the street who come in, buy books, do services, they're not experiencing that kind of experience. I'm talking now about the employees of the church who are put through that kind of rigor, and that's why a bunch of them left eventually, and that's why Scientology is now the world's, they like to position themselves as the world's fastest growing religion, and I always call them now the world's fastest shrinking religion, because they're just tiny, and they've gotten tinier and tinier because of these kind of draconian measures that they were taking on the staff.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other reasons why Scientology is, as you say in your book, imploding in on itself? And what, in your informed opinion, will it take for it to finally take its place in the graveyard of past spiritual movements that people have forgotten about?
Yeah, that's a tough question, that one, because Scientology has amassed quite literally, a couple $1 billion in assets and reserves. And that's a tremendous amount of resource to spend, to keep the organization going, even if no new money came in. It's an abusive group. I've described just one part of those abuses. I was not involved in those call centers because I was part of a whole nother subunit that was a punishment unit and sort of a re-education camp, because I had been questioning things, as I mentioned earlier. And they didn't like the fact that I was questioning things and doing, being a bad Scientologist as a result. And so I was undergoing this other very rigorous disciplinary process that took me 3 years to get through. And, it's just sort of one thing after another. And you can only abuse people like that for so long before they, no matter how fervent of a believer they are, they finally wake up to the fact that that this just isn't, there's no return on investment here. And that was actually where I ended up getting to, and where, other people that I knew have since left also. But you always have, and this is something I've been studying and learning about since I left, you always have a certain percentage of people who will pretty much fall for anything. If it's not flat Earth, then it's 9/11 truthers. If it's not 9/11 truthers, then it's Scientologists. I mean, you can pick your flavor of whatever, woo or nonsense or gullible belief system that people will fall into, but they fall into this stuff. And the sad thing is, in groups like that, is that an outside objective observer can look and see that this person is not being a critical thinker, that they're having to ignore whole swaths of facts and information that they just can't even allow themselves to look at or give any credence to in order to maintain their belief system. And when you're in a mindset like that, and unfortunately to one degree or another, all of us are in a mindset like that to some degree. But when you get cult members, they've really gone all in. And so there's just people who have a proclivity to that, and it takes a lot of work to overcome that. It takes a lot of education. This is why I think critical thinking is so important. Mm-hmm. So as far as the end of Scientology, I don't know that they're going to run out of those people. They are a very tiny organization. They position themselves as having millions of members. This came from Hubbard in the 70s, and because Scientology's so big on numbers and having to have ever increasing numbers, then they'll never admit that they have less than millions of members, even though the truth of the matter is, the objective truth is, there were never millions of members. There were never even 1 million members. They never really went. I mean, it's an estimate, but the highest estimate we have is something like 500,000 worldwide ever involved with it. Not involved with it at one time, but ever, right?
Wow.
Yeah, they keep the names and addresses of every single person who ever buys a book or does a service in the churches. And the largest accumulation of those names and addresses, I believe, is about 600,000 to 700,000 names. So pray tell, where are all these millions of Scientologists when, according to Scientology's own internal records, they don't even have 1 million people who have bought books or done services? So these false claims are just, they're just hot air. And the truth is that they're probably down now to, we estimate, somewhere between 25 to 40,000 members worldwide. And that is not even enough to, I don't know, can you fill Joel Osteen's mega church? With that many people? I think you can. I think maybe you could probably fit all Scientologists in the world into Joel Osteen's place. And that's, there you go. That's all of them. So, so this is not a large group of people. They don't have anywhere near the influence they claim, or this sort of thing. But they do have a lot of money, and they have accumulated a lot of real estate, and they're not really going anywhere right now. So the big question really is, what happens when the current leader, David Miscavige, passes on or moves on, or some people sort of fantasize that he might end up in jail, but I think that's after all the years I've been doing this, I sort of think that's a bit of a pipe dream. The government is not anywhere near motivated enough to go after Scientology, and Scientology is not an apocalyptic cult. They're not going to go to a place where everybody's going to drink Kool-Aid. That's not the end game of Scientology. At least not as I see it. I mean, that theoretically that could happen, but it's not really like that. So what happens? Well, it just sort of continues to putter along is what's going to happen. And when Miscavige either passes on or turns, is he going to turn the reins over to somebody else? Doubtful. He's not that kind of person. He's the kind of person who's going to go all the way until he's dead, or forcefully removed somehow. And then we'll have to see what happens, because he has made it. He gained power through a coup d'etat. He forcefully ousted anybody else who was a challenge to his authority in the mid-1980s. So he knows what that looks like. And he has taken extreme measures internally within his own circles to prevent anyone from getting enough power themselves to challenge his authority. And he's very good at that. So it's doubtful that anybody else is going to step up and try to take him out. So when he passes, is somebody else going to step up, or is it all just going to dissolve? That's the question nobody can really answer with certainty.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking now of David Miscavige, based on the description you just gave of him as kind of the Negan of Scientology. If you get the Walking Dead reference.
Yes, he is. Yes. Another apt analogy is also with the Jehovah's Witnesses. I can't remember the person who started the Jehovah's Witnesses, but he was a very L. Ron Hubbard-like figure. And he was...
Charles Taze Russell?
That's it. Yes, Russell. So Russell passes, and a guy named Rutherford takes over. And Rutherford is very analogous to David Miscavige. He was very ruthless, got rid of his opponents, ran the whole thing with a fairly iron fist. And then he died. And the current regime change, the regime change that happened at that point, was a council of people rose and took over the Jehovah's Witnesses. And these are a bunch of old fogey guys now who, present themselves on stage from time to time, and they're embarrassingly bad speakers, and have been described by one ex-Jehovah's Witness I know as they got there through the survival of the dumbest. And that's who runs the Jehovah's Witnesses now. Such a thing could easily happen with Scientology. Or, like I said, he could pass and the whole thing could just dissolve. That has happened with many destructive cult groups. The thing that makes it doubtful that it would just dissolve away and fade into nothingness is all the fact that all that money is there. And money doesn't just sit around. People have this sort of idea that they should spend it or do something with it, So, what's going to happen with that? There's a lot of lawyers, there's a lot of bank accounts, there's a labyrinth of corporate, structure that protects Scientology's assets. So that's really kind of up in the air as to what could end up happening.
Well, maybe we should get into a little bit about L. Ron Hubbard himself.
Oh boy, yeah.
And some of his background. He started out as a pulp fiction writer and kind of carried over his science fiction slash western slash adventure yarn pulp storytelling and kind of spun it into a belief system.
Yes, he did. Mix in also occult practices, because Hubbard was also involved with the Ordo Templi Orientis and Aleister Crowley's belief systems, magic with a K, right? This sort of thing. Hubbard got involved with a man named Jack Parsons in the 1940s, who was a brilliant rocket scientist who was one of the founders of the Jet Propulsion Laboratories in Pasadena, California, and truly was an innovator when it came to rocket science. But he was also a fanatic about spirituality and magic and sex magic. And people have called him a Satanist, and I don't think that's really an apt term if you think of Satanism as the idea of worshiping a dark god or Satan, or the opposite of God or something. That's not really what that belief system is about.
I on my other podcast I interviewed a priest in the Church of Satan, and they kind of describe themselves as atheists who, they're Ayn Rand enthusiasts who play dress up, basically. Atheists who play dress up.
Yeah, that would be a pretty fit description for L. Ron Hubbard as well. He was very much into that Ayn Rand philosophy. In a way, he was his own guy too. Anyway, point is that the influences of L. Ron Hubbard's, evolution into spiritual guru took a lot of turns, and his involvement in the occult was one of those turns, and it was a fairly significant one. His background as a writer really just indicates that he had an active imagination. His writing was not really great, but he was one of the, pulp fiction greats in that world. His name was recognizable. I don't think the quality of his stories beat out anything like what Ray Bradbury or Isaac Asimov was doing, but or A.E. Van Vogt or any of the greats from that time period. But he was a contributor, and he was very prolific. The thing about L. Ron Hubbard was you could always count on him to pound out 2 or 3 stories in one night even. He was just very prolific. So he sold a lot of stories, and then he got, like I said, after the war, he got involved in some occult circles. And then he came up with, he was also an accomplished hypnotist. And it's not clear, nobody's really been able to answer where he learned hypnotism, but he was good at it. And he used hypnotism at first, as well as some of these other, drawing from some of these other sources, to develop this mental health technology called Dianetics. And in 1950, they published this book called Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. And this was an attempt at taking over psychiatry, because in 1950, psychiatry was not a well-regarded field. It was fairly barbaric in its practices. I mean, ice pick lobotomies, that's not a fantasy. They were doing that. They were carving up people's brains with no concept of what they were doing. And they were treating the mentally ill in pretty bad ways. They have since come out of those dark ages in many, many ways, but psychiatry and psychology still have a lot of study to do and a lot of figuring out of things to do. They're still in their infancy, really. So Hubbard saw an opportunity to take over that field, and he thought that his technique of Dianetics, which was basically a sort of a regression therapy, would be a challenger for that. What Hubbard didn't know how to do was practice actual science. He had no idea what the scientific method actually was. He had failed out of college, remember. He was not a good student. So his ability to study or learn new things or learn from others or get involved in a process where there was going to be peer review and other people were going to, be able to question his work and have something to say about it, he didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. as far as he was concerned, he figured it out. He knew the answers, and he put it in a book, and he said, this is what you do, and if you, it's my way or the highway. You follow what I say, and you're going to be successful, and you're going to, achieve this wonderful new state of being called clear, where you'll be freed from all of the past stresses and trauma and pain of your past, because this process was supposed to bring that about. Originally, that process was a form of hypnotism. He changed it just at the last minute to make it look a little less like hypnotism, even though it still maintained most of the key elements of hypnotism. And he put this book out, and it became a bestseller because people really were interested in self-improvement, and they knew that, psychiatry wasn't necessarily the place to go for that. Psychiatry was a place that locked people up and men in white coats and this sort of thing. Again, this is in 1950.
Right. Yeah, this is something that any purveyor of a new belief system kind of looks for in their prospective receptive audience is, what are they disillusioned about? What are they disappointed about in life? And if it's psychiatry that's going through dark ages, if it's anything else that society by and large is upset about or in some kind of culture war over, that's where they jump in and offer something new.
Well, exactly. And in 1950, this was a brand new idea. You didn't have in 1950 bookstores with whole sections on self-help. This was just a couple of years after World War II. The country was recovering. This is the baby boomer generation just getting started, as I understand it. The Cold War was just getting going. So, there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of happiness about having won the war, but then there was a lot of uncertainty about the future. Nuclear weapons had been developed or were being developed. Atomic weapons had been used. So it was a pretty wild time, and there was a lot of uncertainty. And there was a lot of hope for the future and a lot of hope that technology would provide solutions and answers to the problems of life. So Hubbard comes in with this thing and says it's the modern science of mental health. And he uses words like technology to describe the techniques of what he's put forward. And people ate it up. They loved the idea. They thought, wow, we could read this book, sit down with another person who's also read the book, and we can just sit here and counsel one another using this technique and be better people and be faster thinkers, be more clear-headed, come up with better solutions to our problems, not get sick anymore. This was a huge claim of Dianetics, is that Hubbard, out of thin air, out of nowhere, came up with this percentage that 75 to 80% of all illnesses are psychosomatic in nature. There is zero basis on which to make that claim, but that never stopped Hubbard from making a claim. And so he says this in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, and he says, with this Dianetic technique, you can solve and cure psychosomatic illnesses because they're coming, from your mind. So if we address your mind and we address these incidents then of pain and unconsciousness in your past, then we will resolve cancer, bad eyesight, leukemia, arthritis, gout. He had a whole panoply, a whole array of illnesses that he said were psychosomatically caused. And people expected this to work. Well, give it a year or two, a runaway bestseller. Hubbard's running around the country lecturing and giving seminars and workshops. But after a year or two, people are finding he's making claims he can't fulfill. And so they're leaving. They're like, yeah, this isn't working out. And that was eventually Hubbard, the con man, kind of came out. He was spending all the money as fast as it was being made. He was, these little groups were forming, and he was sort of being a little dictator. People didn't appreciate that. His personal life was a complete shambles. And so he bankrupted it. He got a bailout from a millionaire named Don Purcell in Wichita, Kansas. That tanked. And Hubbard lost his copyrights to Dianetics because the bailout, had made him lose his rights. So he really had no choice. He had a very, very tiny number of followers at that point. And he drove off to Phoenix, Arizona, and they started the Church of Scientology. And he decided that instead of going the route of trying to take over psychiatry through science, which he had no credentials for, and was just being universally panned by scientists all over the country, and the AMA and the APA thought he was a joke. So he then went, okay, and he fulfilled the earlier promise that he had where he thought, the way to get rich is to start a religion. And you can make claims as a religious leader that you can't make as a scientist. You can make all the claims you want to cure people's illnesses as a religious leader because it's a faith-based claim. If you make that claim as a scientist, you better back it up with proof and evidence and peer review. As a faith healer, you can say whatever you want, Peter Popoff, man, evil spirits be out. So that was the route that Hubbard decided to go, and legally it got him out of a lot of hot water. And the Church of Scientology then slowly, very slowly but surely, amassed followers as a church and as a spiritual belief system, I should say, really. And it proceeded to take off.
And the rest is history.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, L. Ron Hubbard was also very habitually a person who told tall tales about himself and kind of presented himself as a real life pulp fiction hero. And this comes out very strongly in his own account of his experience in the Navy during World War II.
Yes.
And all of his supposed war exploits, like being the sole survivor of a downed warship, rafting to an island, escaping into the jungle.
Yeah, he was. It's almost as though he couldn't help himself. I have referred to him as a pathological liar, and I use that in a clinical sense. I really believe he just couldn't help himself. He would tell one group of people one thing, another group of people a completely different thing about the same time period. And he was confident in the time that there was no fact checking. These people were never going to talk to each other. There wasn't going to be no record of this. And so he just thought, hey, I can just say whatever I want. And he was always the kind of person who was the life of the party. He was a big man. He would walk in the room. He had flaming red hair. He was apparently, before he got older, he was somewhat attractive. And so, he ended up having 3 wives, even though he only claimed he had 2, and a number of children. And he was a serial philanderer. But he was one of these, like, ha ha ha. He always had a hearty tale for you. And he always liked being the center of attention. That was his nature. So, his whole personality lent itself to being a cult leader. It was a totally natural fit for him.
And in reality, he was kind of shuffled from post to post and from position to position in the military because of his incompetence.
Yeah.
And wasn't there an incident at one point off the coast of Oregon where he basically bombed the hell out of something that turned out not to be a submarine at all?
Yeah, this was during the World War II period, and he was given command of a small, a very small skiff type boat. I don't know the word for it, but it had a few guns on it, and he was patrolling the coast of Oregon, and he got it in his head that they had spotted a Japanese submarine off the coast, and so they spent 2 days or something just bombing run after bombing run, trying to take this non-existent submarine out. They never found any evidence. In fact, a very full investigation was done after the fact of this whole incident by the military, and Hubbard ended up being told in no uncertain terms, "You screwed up, son." And then he took his boat down to off the coast of Mexico where they sent him. And there was a little shoal or island off the coast of Mexico, which was not supposed to be used for, if I remember this right, wasn't supposed to be used for target practice, or wasn't supposed to be used as Hubbard ended up using it. He ended up shooting a bunch of guns at this thing, literally created a little bit of a mini international incident for which he was relieved of his command. That was L. Ron Hubbard's war experience. He didn't suffer war wounds and injuries. He didn't go shoot Japanese, or Philippines or anybody over in Australia, or rescue Australia from the Japanese. Nothing like this ever occurred. And he made so many claims about his war record. He claimed he had been in the Atlantic Theater, the Pacific Theater, that he had been down in Indonesia. I mean, just all these crazy stories, which his actual, once researchers got onto this and got his military records, they quickly found that all of this was an utter fantasy.
And he actually had an opportunity to participate in the Battle of Okinawa, but he basically bailed. And several other examples throughout his time in the military of L. Ron Hubbard bailing from actual service.
Yeah,
when he thought there was going to be action involved.
Yeah, he's not. It's funny because one of L. Ron Hubbard's statements in Scientology is that liars are inevitably cowards and cowards are inevitably liars. Well, projection much? I think he might have been talking about himself there.
Yep.
So
there's this mysterious 1938 work that Hubbard put out called Excalibur, which a lot of people have said was kind of a forerunner to Dianetics. This was originally titled The One Command, and it basically came about through an experience Hubbard had on an anesthetic table. Let's talk about what is the importance to the inception of Scientology of this mysterious work, because this is something I've only recently learned about and read about.
Oh yeah, I feel it was actually from my study of the history of it and knowing what Hubbard himself said about the work, I feel it's seminal. I feel it's a very important part of the chronology of Hubbard's life and his motivations, and about the eventual creation of Dianetics and Scientology. In 1938, and by the way, L. Ron Hubbard was born in 1911, so he was 28 years old at the time of this surgery. He had a dental surgery or dental incident, and he was out, and he from the drugs, and he had a vision of dying. He claimed that he died on the table. Whether that's true or not, we have zero record of this. We just have his account, at least as far as I know. But he claimed to have died. And when he died, he went to, this tunnel of light and went to a place where he saw all of the answers of the universe laid out before him like a smorgasbord, he said. And he was able to see all of this information and be amazed and delighted and oh my goodness. And he comes back to Earth and he's not supposed to remember. They're supposed to make him forget, but they didn't really make him totally forget, and he wasn't supposed to know this, and he comes back, and he wakes up from this surgery, or they revive him, or whatever actually happened, we don't know. I do believe something happened. I do believe that he had some kind of incident, because Hubbard absolutely hated doctors, and specifically dentists, after this. Lifelong hatred. And as far as I know, it started with this incident. I don't think he had a problem with doctors and medicine before that. I could be wrong about that. But we do know for a fact that he hated doctors and dentists after this. And he felt that he had had an epiphany, a revelation, that the concept of survival was the motivating factor behind all of life. Every effort of life was to survive, and there were lots of corollaries and various outgrowths of this principle. But this was the one command: survive. Hubbard said, the way he put it was, it's as though when life began, it was given this one command, and that command is to survive. And so every motivation, everything that happens is all a result of a person's attempt to do that, to keep going into infinity and beyond. I mean, it's not just live your life and survive until you're dead, but to continue to survive in some fashion or another. And this is kind of important because L. Ron Hubbard wrote a letter to his wife called the Skipper letter, because he calls her Skipper in this letter, where he makes it very clear that he has a very strong intention and purpose for his life to slam, what he said was slam his name into history, like forcefully, right? Like he thought that the way to gain immortality was to be remembered for his works, or to somehow slam his name into the history books. And he told his wife that this was his motivating force and purpose for his life. So he wrote a book immediately following this whole incident. And this book was called The One Command, or The Dark Sword, or Excalibur. It had a couple different names, but they settled on Excalibur. And Hubbard felt that this book was going to be revelatory to the entire world. It was going to change everything. I think he said he claimed that he sat down and wrote the whole thing in a 5-day frenzy of activity. And he called his publicist, and he called these publishers together, and he got like 5 or 6 of them together at a station in New York. And he said, this is it. This is the bomb diggity. This is the thing everybody's been looking for. This is going to be more popular than the Bible. It was a claim that he made. Well, nobody was really interested. Nobody really wanted the book. And he, in a huff, packed it up, went back to Washington State, where he had lived at the time, and put it away. Fine, it's too good for them, sort of thing. And it didn't see the light of day again until the mid-1940s, when Hubbard sort of dusted it off and took out this principle of survival and married it with some of the occult practices that he had since learned as part of the OTO, and married it with hypnotism as a methodology, and created Dianetics. And through 1949, he worked very closely with John Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding Magazine, and kind of a science fiction guru, big player in the science fiction writing world. And Campbell believed that Hubbard was actually onto something valid and real. And he did a Dianetics type session, this hypnotism type session with Hubbard, and felt that he had cured something that a physical ailment that he had. And so he was sold on it, lock, stock, and barrel. And he wanted everybody to find out what this was all about. And he gave Hubbard in 1949, he let him stay at his New Jersey home. Hubbard pounded out Dianetics, Modern Science, Mental Health, and that's how that all happened. But it sprung from, all of this goes back to this supposed surgery or incident or dental operation, whatever it was that actually happened, we don't know. But we do know that Hubbard put this book together, or manuscript together, and he absolutely believed that he was onto something fierce. It's possible that Hubbard was starting a con at that point, but I don't think so. I don't think you can, run a con with that. When he was saying what he was saying in private letters as well as in the public. I think he really believed that he was onto something. And Hubbard had a lot of personal faults. The pathological lying is not something Hubbard thought of as a fault, but he had physical ailments, he had physical disabilities, he definitely had problems with interpersonal relationships. Like I said, he was a serial philanderer. So he had a hard time making money, keeping his money. He would spend it as fast as he would get it. His war record was a dismal failure, and he knew it. But he lied about it. But he knew he had not been a war hero, even if he claimed he was. So he was not happy with himself, and he was not happy with the circumstances of his life. And come the mid-1940s, we have private papers showing this, proving this out. And so his return to Excalibur, I think, was an effort to try to revive a potential process through which he could handle his own problems and potentially help other people too. Because I think he kind of got off on the idea that he was helping other people too. I think he really did take some joy in that. But it ran counter to these darker parts of his personality, which could get pretty dark. So that's kind of the backstory on that.
Okay, and there is some connection, as I understand it, between the claims he made about Excalibur being a work that would cause people to lose their minds or die upon learning its contents, and then
he was marketing his book like Hubbard would do. There is no reason whatsoever to believe anything he says about this. But right. Hubbard did claim in lectures that he gave to Scientologists years later, and I listened to these lectures, I've heard him say this, that this book was so powerful that when people would read it, how he described it. Here, I'll tell you exactly how he described it, because you might find this kind of funny and interesting. He said that this book would give you a sort of a spiritual or intellectual super drive or a super awareness. And the analogy that he made is, he said, imagine a two-dimensional worm, a two-dimensional creature that only can see length and width, right? And is completely unaware of the concept of height or depth or something, right? Completely unaware of a third dimension. And this thing is crawling along, and this little worm is worming its way along in its two-dimensional space, and it suddenly bumps into a three-dimensional object. Well, it would have absolutely no idea why it was stopped. It wouldn't understand the concept of bumping into something that had height. Well, he said that if you could get that concept, and you could then see in three dimensions and become aware of three dimensions, that this would be called going up the pole. Because imagine that this object, this worm bumps into, is a pole. And the worm becomes aware of it and starts climbing up the pole, and suddenly can see whole new vistas of awareness and that it had never even dreamed or conceived of before. That analogy being what it is, Hubbard said that is what Excalibur did for people, is it would make them go up the pole. And they would be so amazed and so delighted and so excited and in such a state of apoplexy about all these new experiences and awarenesses and heightened ability that they suddenly felt like they had, that they went a little nuts. And he said that one or two people committed suicide. He said another person left his wife and his entire life behind and ran off with some woman. And another person thought that, he said another publisher told him that this was, living lightning, very dangerous stuff. Was too dangerous for the world. So these were the stories Hubbard made up about Excalibur to try to get across to people the mythology of the power of what he had discovered. When really all he discovered and wrote about was a book about how, we're all kind of in it for ourselves, and we're all in it to survive, and the winner is the guy who outdoes everybody else. That's kind of really all that he really wrote about. I mean, there's only one other person we know who read the manuscript and wrote about it. And he wrote a very short article. His name was Arthur J. Burks. And I think I quoted the entire article in my book because it's the only thing we have. Because the manuscript itself of Excalibur isn't anywhere. The Church of Scientology has it. It's locked up in the archives of their buildings, and they're never letting it out. So it's very hard to find anybody who has even seen this manuscript, much less read it. We're talking about a very small number of people. So I republished this, this article of what Arthur J. Burks wrote, and what he wrote was not impressive. I mean, he wasn't impressed by it. He didn't think it was anything special. He said it was a little weird. He said it sort of twisted your head a little bit. It got you thinking in very weird ways because Hubbard's way of thinking about this whole survival thing was a little off. And you get that from reading Burke's description of it. Hubbard never let it out. He said that all the important parts had pretty much been put out through the materials of Dianetics and Scientology, and so he never felt any need to pull out Excalibur and give it to anybody or publish it as its own work after he came up with Dianetics and Scientology.
Thank you for listening to A Leap of Doubt. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on iTunes. If you want to get involved in the kinds of discussion this show is meant to encourage, you can find the official discussion group on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/A Leap of Doubt. You can follow me and get in touch with me on Twitter, where my username is @TheNatheist. Feedback and criticisms are always welcome. The opening clip is an excerpt from the audiobook God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, courtesy of Hachette Audio. Text copyright 2007 by Christopher Hitchens. Audio production copyright 2007, Hachette Audio. Used with permission. The opening and ending music is Jade by Esther Nicholson and is used under license. A very special shout out and heartfelt thanks goes out to my 4 patrons, Jeff Prebeg, Jeannie Eichard, Torsten Pill, and Chris Watson. If you enjoy the work I do, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/A Leap of Doubt.